Yeah,
You were a bit, you know, yeah.
big, right?
Yeah, just under view.
She's taking the bin now.
Yeah, I know.
Give me 2 seconds and I'll check it on the website and make sure we're actually streaming.
I just got plain dairy milk. I believe in unadulterated.
Really,
Yeah, I don't really like other stuff myself.
I'm definitely a first person myself. Looks off and run again. Just keep going until that.
Sarah should be here, but she might be a bit late.
Okay, no worries. You can make a dramatic entrance.
Yeah, that's right. I actually have to stop by, there's some sweet shops, and I have to stop and get my wife some coffee.
Well, there's some people who think it's actually, you know, you can.
You want some coffee?
This is-
Sure.
Alright.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
All the rest is for you, Andrew. You have to eat it all.
I will.
Yeah, it's all yours.
I've already had lunch.
That's not an excuse.
No one's gonna take it from you. You gotta sit there.
Yeah, I'm not that intimidating. I'm gonna leave it right here.
Is everything
We are good to go.
good to go? Alrighty. So hi, for those of you that don't know, I'm Tara. And I'm a PhD student here who works on game design for archaeology, specifically looking at can game design be an appropriate tool for archaeologists as a way of knowledge formation? And part of that is also game critique of existing games. So what we're going to be looking at today is this great game called Hoyuk, which very broadly speaking is a tile placement, tug of war, area control, value acquiring, domination board game. So already there's a lot going on. And if you just look at the board, you can kind of tell it's not an instantly accessible game to play. There's a lot of layers to it. Thematically, obviously as Hoyuk, it's based upon the settlement of Anatolian populations during the Neolithic phase. And in the rulebook, this is quite broadly defined and actually goes everywhere from Epi-Paleolithic through Neolithic, and it draws a lot of things in. So there's some potential issues there, but aesthetically there is some good stuff going on, also some bad stuff, these little roundhouses. There's some things for discussion there. Anyway, in the rulebook it states that the purpose of the game is to build the best settlement and score the most victory points, which is getting a little bit close to some of the rhetoric we've been hearing recently out of some countries. Not necessarily, not necessarily in line with a lot of the sort of archaeological evidence coming out of especially Hoyuk. So how do you play? This is going to be a very abridged version because the rulebook, although quite small, has a lot of rules which are quite difficult to get a hold of from a preliminary layer. So the first sort of stage is that each player represents a clan, and each clan has a power and a certain thing. So one is really religious and they hate all other religions. One just hates everyone else and likes to destroy their stuff for fun, I guess. And then another one has the power to move this little dude, the shaman. And for some reason they're not religious, but they have a shaman. And anyway, so you represent this clan, and at the beginning you pick up one of these board tiles. And these basically tell you what you're going to do. And every single board tile has build 2 things plus one sort of additional, either a family or a shrine or an oven or a buffalo or a sheep or insert large amount of stuff here. So as part of that, you basically place them on the board, and there's a lot of rules which govern how you can place stuff. You can't place them diagonally to each other. You have to place your houses next to each other within a block. Each block is scored individually, blah, blah, blah. So without getting into that too much, we'll just skip ahead. If you really want to know the rules, we can go through that later. So the remainder of the players repeat. So you can play with anything from 2 to 5 players, and it quite dramatically changes the experience of the game. The process then repeats a second time. So you basically have 2 turns of placing houses, placing 4 houses, and between 1 and 2 separate entities as well, depending on what you pull. So then the clan powers are activated, and these can be really, really nasty. Then a catastrophe card hits, and these range anything from wolves raging in and destroying your ovens, to tornado killing, to ritual sacrifices atop the Great Mound of Hoyuk. There's a lot of things that can happen with these. Some of them are actually really good and really well thought through, and the wolves oven thing is a bit weird. You then go through into a scoring phase after the catastrophe hits, But before this, there's also a stack resolution phase, which means that if you have cards in your hand, asset cards, you can play them, which then causes a whole other set of large rule-based issues to contend with. Anyway, the blocks then get judged, and if you have the most resources in a block, so if I have the most ovens here, I get to draw another oven card. If I have the most shrines, I get a shrine card. So it becomes like a nice little capitalist economy where, without much competition, you kind of just get ahead and you get all the assets and someone's crying in the corner, but you're having a great time. So that's good. So then you go through your asset card build phase again, which also happens in here. And then the last player places all the last houses, or the last player, gotta get this rule straight in my head. The first player to place their last house ends the game. So if you've placed more houses than other people, the game ends early. So it's directly beneficial to place houses as fast as you can, just on the board, and just force the game to finish. Points are then finally tallied after all of this, and a winner is crowned. So, as we can see, there are a lot of pieces in this game. This is not your let's have a nice casual family game for 5 minutes. This is Risk, the archaeological edition. You're in it for the night. So again, I'm not going to read all these out, but basically there's just a lot of stuff. And one of my bugbears, it's not anything to do with archaeology, but the box doesn't come with a box organizer. So all this stuff is just thrown in there. So every time you go to sit up, you're like, oh God. And it becomes a bit like an archaeological excavation, just figuring out oh God, how did that, wow, that's interesting, that's fun.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, so then the game in theory is not language dependent. So it works on these hieroglyphics, right? And that is a really great idea at a basic level. The problem is that in practice, it's actually really frustrating. For example, these are not the same card. These are the same card. I still have literally no idea what this is supposed to be. I've asked 8 separate people and had 8 separate responses as to what this whole scenario is. So you can kind of see, these are supposed to represent the archaeological flavor of the game, and some of them are really good, and I actually really like this as a concept. Unfortunately, a lot of them don't actually match up very well, so you'll find weaving stuff in a oven, and you'll find reeds in, there's just a lot of mismatch between what's going on. So something that could have been a really powerful learning tool becomes just oh, it just happens to be there for fun. Another thing to note as well is that a lot of the archaeology is actually not quite right in the game. Almost, but not quite. So there are 3 modes that you can play as. Basic, which basically reduces the amount of assets that you have. Medium, which adds the shaman, another set of assets, and another set of catastrophes, and expert, which activates the clan powers. This doesn't necessarily make the game harder or more interesting. It just kind of adds more stuff to contend with, which you could argue is, if you're really into your high-level 4X strategy games, tactical management, it does make it interesting. But if you're wanting to just have a nice, happy game where you think about archaeology, this is probably a little problematic. So the playtime, once you know what you're doing, it takes about 15 minutes to set up. The first time I set it up, it took about an hour, because you're just what is this? Also, provided you bring your own packaging, that's a necessity for this game. It takes, at best, another 60 minutes to play. And the more players you start to add in, that's for 2 players. The more players you add in, the more, the longer length of time it takes. This is all kind of set out nicely on the box. 2 to 5, 60 minutes, building game, thinking, and party. Yeah. So my method for kind of going through through this game was I basically went through and played the game 28 times with a whole set of different people. So I went through twice with archaeologists and twice with game designers as the basic 2-player, and then onwards from there. So I really wanted to get a hand on wow, how do archaeologists think about this game? How do game designers? Is it good design and archaeologists should just get over it? Or is there something that's actually problematic here? So we'll go into a little bit of a design breakdown versus Hoyuk, the game. And in the true tradition of RuPaul's Drag Race, category is experience. So the first thing to sort of ask is the game experience well defined? What am I getting out of this game? What am I supposed to feel when I play it? Does every rule in that rule book contribute significantly to that experience, or is it just arbitrary stuff that you have to follow? And does this experience really match up with the learning and play objectives? Now, here's Andrew, he's here, he can tell you a bit about it later. But his quote was that my experience was frustration. So if your game experience is defined as frustration, that's probably not the best sort of way to be framing your game. The next one is Nick, who's a game designer, and he basically said that whilst highly tactical, the game failed to really offer me a well-defined experience outside of tactical joy. I would struggle to describe the last hour other than as frustrating. So I guess in this sense, like, it does have a well-defined experience, just maybe not the one they were going for. In line with that, a lot of the frustration of this game comes from the rule set. It comes from the fact that the rules are often contradictory, and they often are not even stated, so you're kind of left to argue amongst each other as to how you should interpret something, which could be a powerful mechanic, but it ends up in this instance just being like, oh God, again. But we've got some house rules now, so that's good. Next category is skill or chance. So is the game skill or luck oriented? And if luck is incorporated, is it incorporated well? So like we all know, right, like in our daily lives, like there's a lot of luck that you have to contend with, but often like it's well managed, or we manage to manage it to an extent where it makes sense. Same archaeologically, we find things which are the result of chance, happenstance. But is that incorporated into the game? And Megan, who's here as well, said, well, that seems random. And then Nick again here says, I mean, skill is a part, insofar as everyone wants to play a skill game. And what he means here is that if everyone sits down to play a high-level tactical game, you can get a lot out of this. If there is one player who sits down and doesn't want to play that game or is not interested, the whole thing falls apart. So random chance and other players trolling has too much of an impact on my ability to play a skill game. In the end, you kind of end up questioning whether you win the game based upon your skill or whether you win it based upon luck, which kind of brings up a lot of questions about like what are the mechanics of this game? What are we supposed to be learning archaeologically? Like, is it about the random chance of like disasters in the past and the impact that they had on these sites? Or is it about the people who built these places? The mechanic that's currently presented very much falls in line with chance, whilst also being layered over a high-level tactical 4X game. So the next part is theme, and I think this is probably the one which is most interesting for us as archaeologists as like a critical reception studies-based question. So is the game theme well-defined, and does every mechanic and aesthetic within that board contribute significantly to that theme and our understanding of the past? And again, does this match up with learning and play? So Sam, who's a game developer, said, I'm a little confused. Did wolves destroy ovens back then? Why would the gods smite the person who makes the most offerings to them? So this is talking about the catastrophe cards, which often their resolution is just really random stuff. It's like, destroy 5 houses of double story in this block, and you're like, what, there's a flood? Like a tidal wave? How did that happen? What's going on? So it makes it a little hard to kind of comprehend the impact of natural disasters versus the actual process of like construction and destruction that we see at these sites. So the mechanic is not necessarily reflecting archaeological findings. The next one is, it makes it seem like a very cutthroat, capitalistic place crossed with the in-house fighting of the Jersey Shore that was plagued by natural disasters on a daily basis. Now, this is not my understanding of Hoyuk. This is not what I found when I went to the site. So the fact that we have people like, these are both game developers and designers, but the fact that they're walking away from this game with this idea that that's what the past is like, and that's embedded in the mechanics, the way that you play the game, not just the way it looks, like that's a problem. Aesthetic things we can change very easily. Mechanical things are really difficult, and they have a lasting impact on how people think about not only their place now in the world, but their place in the past as well. As kind of a side note, archaeologically, the houses in this game are exclusively destroyed by natural disasters. The blocks themselves are all set up around street design, so there's actual streets and ways that you move between them, rather than them being this like very stacked, tightly packed thing that we see. But a good point, we have a good point. Some of the cards have really great archaeology on them. Like you see the stone seals, you see the clay balls, like there's some really good stuff, but it's never explained, and they turn up in really random places. Like, as I said, you'll often get like reeds in the oven or like clay balls in the sheep pens, and like some of it would make sense, but it is just random the way that it's distributed. And kind of in line with that, as good as some of the aesthetics are, it has no bearing on gameplay. They're just there. So you could literally substitute this with like space people and the game would still work. Like it doesn't necessarily reflect anything archaeological. Although there is like the river which runs through between the two mounds, which is a nice little callback to actually Hoyuk. So props for that. So the next category is clarity, and this is like my big bugbear about game design. So are the rules well-defined and easy to understand? Are there limited contradictions? And are pathways to resolution set up well? No is the answer to all of these. Why are there 4 different words for the same thing, and why are there 3 different graphical representations of that? So you see here, like these are all the same thing, all 3 of these, and they all 3 have different graphical representations and are referred intermittently to as 3 separate things within the rules, which makes it very hard to kind of grasp. Again, if this was a construct to represent like different things within the game space or different interpretations, that would be fine, but it just is. There's no explanation for why this exists. And then the next one is, I'm not sure what the play order rule pictures are meant to indicate. Send help, please. Which was what I was saying about that little hieroglyphic before. The game tries this thing of being abstract from language, but doesn't quite follow it through enough to make it, really well executed. Do we interpret that as all the houses, only the ones with X, or that none are affected? So this is the catastrophe resolution phase, where there's a set of lines which says like, if there are like each house, each block with X amount of stuff happens, then destroy X amount of houses within that. But it's really hard to interpret whether that means if there are no houses, no blocks are affected. If there are blocks with the same, are they all affected? It's just not well structured, which again could be a really powerful mechanical argument about what's happening in the past and how things like scale and density and the movement of people affect things. But instead it just becomes a point where it's like, no, we're not thinking about this anymore. We just want to finish the game. Next point is pacing curve, the pacing curve of this game. Is the game sort of like, when we talk about game design, we always say, are games easy to learn but difficult to master? So this is the concept that you can jump right in and have a really fun experience, but if you want to get really good at it, it's hard. Does every player have interesting choices to make throughout? And do these choices scale with the game intensity? So, game designers again, I really enjoyed the tactical aspect of the game. It's surprisingly deep and offers really good or decent replayability. And this is true of the game, like the actual underpinning of it is good and it has a really fun and replayable nature to it, which is a little bit toned down by the fact that it has way too much going on to begin with, but it does offer some great decision-making elements. This means that each player is having to actually think and engage with each other throughout play to think, why would I be putting houses here and how am I going to screw over my opponent? That second part might not be really what we're trying to get across in this game, but the first part definitely has some really interesting potential applications for thinking about archaeology and specifically this site. Finally, I want to talk about the balance of the game, which is just it's a disaster. Is the game balanced? No. If there is imbalance, is it fun or serves an integral purpose? So like the reason why game balance is important is that it's like, you want people to have a good experience of your game and to get a good experience of it together and learn from that experience. If there's unfair imbalance, you're just like, I don't care what this board game's trying to tell me. I just want to be done and go get coffee, eat some burgers, just get over it. But you can have imbalance, or you can have really hard weighted scales, so long as it's fun or so long as it serves a purpose which is interesting to the player. Where this game falls down is, as we'll see in these quotes, the imbalances are not fun, and a lot of them are just not well thought through. So Nick again says, what the hell are all those clan powers? Who thought that was a good idea? Broken expletive. And basically it's this thing again, which the clan powers don't actually add much to the game, and they actually destroy it, with one clan's ability being basically to move the shaman, which does nothing, and one clan's ability being to destroy whatever house they want once every turn. Like, you can kind of see that playing as the person who randomly gets assigned the yellow team, your enjoyment of the game is just like, I'm gonna sit here for an hour and a half and just have the crap beaten out of me. It's a bit like Monopoly when you get behind, right? Similar mechanic. Interestingly, Monopoly was based on a game which was supposed to warn about, capitalistic intentions. And I think this game falls a bit into that trap. It's trying to make arguments about a society which is very different from this like high capitalist consumerist culture, but ends up using exactly those mechanics to try and make those arguments. So another thing is, this is one of the expert level things. How did the buffalo make it through testing? Mathematically, they are Imber. Practically, they are just stupid. And so this refers to at the start of the game, buffalo don't get assigned a pen, so you have to put them into an existing pen. The problem is if you haven't, by luck of the draw, received a pen from the game, which is the only way you can get pens, you can't do anything. You just lose, money. So you're like, well, there goes my buffalo running off into the wilderness, I guess. And so, it's just not very well thought through, I think, that mechanic. So it's kind of the discussion point to this. The game, I mean, as hard as I've been on it, I think it has a lot of potential, and it is aesthetically very pleasing. Some of the aesthetics need tightening up to make it more reminiscent of the Neolithic past, but there are some really good things going on. However, and this is where it starts to get bad again, there is what we call ludonarrative dissonance, which means that the narrative the game's trying to say, about what the Neolithic is, and how they make their ludology, how they make their actual gameplay, is just completely disconnected. It makes no sense here. Also, the rules are often confusing and contradictory, which makes the player experience really frustrating. The experience as well is not well enough defined, which also ties into this. The narrative of the game, what the point of playing this is not well enough tied into how it feels to play and what the experience is to really make it a tight thing which you could walk away and say the Neolithic was kind of like this, or I learned this about it. And then so sort of to move beyond a game that just happens to use a Neolithic flavor to a game which is actually a game about the Neolithic, a Neolithic game, a lot of changes need to be made. And so I did some digging into why this might be the case. Also as a point, sorry, before I move on, just read my notes. The game, this thing of suffering from ludonarrative dissonance is really common in archaeology games. There's this tendency to kind of just slap an archaeological picture onto stuff and be like, oh, it's about the past now. But the mechanics itself still are just what we always push out in games, whether that's either digital games or also board games as well. And this is what we're seeing here. And in line with it, there are some potentially ethical problems, which I hope that Megan, who's here, can speak to in a bit. Ultimately, as well, there's a huge difference between what we see on site and what we see in this game. And it's not that these two things need to be one-to-one. We don't need Hoyuk, the excavation game, over the past 35 years of excavation. It's finding how we can make the experience, Hoyukness, as Laia has said, how can we put that into a game? Or just Hoyukness in this case, I guess. So why was this the case? Why has this game gone from being, why does it have these mechanics? Why does it have all this amazing cacophony of stuff going on? And the game was actually originally released as a downloadable PDF, and in that form, it still has problems, but it's actually quite tight because it was meant to be downloaded, printed, and played. Since then, it went on to Kickstarter, and this is kind of where a lot of the problems start to creep in. It has what we like to call it in development feature creep, which is they basically started to offer more cards, more things, more catastrophes, more shamans, more everything as rewards for people to pay. If you pay money and we get past a certain amount of money, we'll put the stuff into the game. And so the further down you go, the less well thought out a lot of them seem to get. So it's the family is quite good. These cards are really good. The buffalo, no, that's no. And then by the time you're getting down into these, it's just I have no idea what's happening. So what are some potential fixes that we could make for this game? Can we basically hack this game to make it more archaeologically interesting for us to play? And a kind of big change that I would like to see made is the core mechanic of the game. At the moment, it's this really competitive resource acquisition, beat on your neighbor to try win some points game. And I think that it would be served much better by having a collaborative game versus the board. So basically what we're trying to do is work through ideas of environmental management and relationship management within your Hoyuk. And basically thinking through how do we strategically place this stuff? How do we deal with the regulated building and destruction of buildings? How do we deal with our religion and our ideas of like spirituality within the space, whatever you want to call it, like how incorporating that so that you're working with other players against the board rather than against each other. The next thing is to change the disaster mechanic. A lot of the disasters are just like tornadoes hit and like 3 tornadoes hit in the space of a week, and it's a bit like, oh God, what's happening? And then I think there's the potential, like, I mean, the wolves destroying the ovens just absolutely kills me as well. But I think that we have a lot of archaeologically evidenced disasters as well, like not like, oh God, massive like biblical disasters necessarily, but things which like impact day-to-day life and things which happen seasonally. And I think there's a real potential to kind of make those disaster mechanics not just like absolutely catastrophic and kind of frustrating, but actually interesting about how life was or might have been. Remove the clan pals, just get rid of them, they make no sense. And also in line with that, add a mechanic for planned destruction and construction of houses. This game entirely revolves around construction is good, destruction is bad. And to kind of flip that around, you need to make it so that you don't get points for more houses, or if you do, it makes sense in some way. So kind of how do you make this construction, destruction, a mechanic which is not penalizing, but is actually the point of the game, or at least speaks to the archaeological stuff that we find. Minor point, but put a goddamn box organizer in the box. Like, oh, it is literally an archaeological excavation every time you open that thing up and try to get everything out.
Maybe that was a stretch goal. They didn't quite
Or maybe that was the stretch goal. The box itself is an excavation. Another kind of minor point, not archaeological, but make the symbols consistent. And then again, you find that every single one of the meeples and every single one of the representations in this game is male. The only time a female exists is as like possibly a wife, possibly a daughter. It's not well described. And that's the only representation that women have. Everything else is men. Men are working, men are building, men are destroying, men are being affected by everything. And that's quite far from the reality. So that's, again, something that I'd like to talk about. And I think that Megan can speak to that quite a lot as well. That's all I have from like a kind of breakdown part of the game. But I'm more than happy to discuss and take questions and show what's going on with it as well.
Great, thank you, Tara.
Questions?
I'm really interested in this. We're talking about the capitalistic nature of the sort of narrative. And I was thinking about risk, because you were saying about risk at the beginning. I think in a way risk's quite effective like that, because it does have this sort of super competitive strategic thing, and it's quite a good representation in some ways of global politics in that era. So how would you do something similar here when we know so little? What would the goal be? Because we obviously don't know, or do we know a huge amount about the culture in society? I don't know. So how would you like to see that represented in a game like this?
Well, I think, like, for me, as you say, like, Risk works because it's a game about territorial conquering and about expansionism. This is a game which is about expansionism and acquiring stuff, about a place which, although we might not know a lot, and I'm sure Colleen can speak much better about this, as well as Sarah, that just doesn't seem to be what's happening there. And so to have a mechanic which is literally saying, like, the past was about generating stuff, like, I win by having the most shrines. I'm better because I have 5 shrines and you have 2. Pathetic. Like, that's not a interesting rhetoric to make about Hoyuk. I mean, something, and I think this goes back to the thing as well, the game tries to do so much. It's about like house building, asset acquirement, movement, blah, blah, blah. Taking one thing, like whether that's the construction and destruction of houses, and just making a game about that. Like, it's tight, it's an experience that you can understand, and then you can layer it. That didn't really answer your question. That was just me ranting for 5 minutes.
There isn't an answer per se, but I was just, that's interesting. So you're sort of saying there are things we know about, and you could actually have a tight focus structure around those things rather than trying to just...
Or alternatively, I mean, it's hard in a board game, but I know that there's Sam, the mathematician, who's actually a game designer as well, and works in astrophysics. But he's making a game which is about, like, event horizons. And so it's like, we don't know a lot. Like, we know that we have hypotheses, but he's making a game which is like, how do we come to this hypothesis? How do we know this? So like, the game, like, it sounds really boring, but it's really fun, trust me. And I think there's a potential here as well. A lot of the time when we do representations in games, it's of the past as it was, rather than being deconstructive about it and saying, well, like, actually, as archaeologists, like, we know, like, this is what we have, this is the artifacts we have, this is how we're using them. But we put ourselves into the picture then and we say, like, this is how we're constructing it, or this is why we think what we do. And I think that hasn't been done at all, as far as I know. In a few digital games, yes, but not board games. So potentially having a game which was more about why we know what we know or how we know what we know than just being like, here is Hoyuk, the, you know, thing, the experience, the game.
I think it's really interesting, though, the idea that you could use a board game to critique, I mean, the idea of pre-state societies, and that they've been reimagined as this really interesting capitalistic thing, whereas no, that was absolutely not what was going on. The acquisitiveness is not displayed in that way, and so trying to say that there are different ways of thinking about the past, and the ways you would actually force people into thinking about the past in different ways through a board game. That's a challenge.
Well, one of the mechanics that's stated in the rules, but which in my 28 plays never, like no one ever did it, is that it explicitly states, because like blocks only get scored if there are other people in it. So like you have to basically try to convince other people to come live in your block. And that mechanic's actually really interesting, because that's about like collaboration and building things well. But what actually happens is people are just like, oh, screw you. Like, I'm just going to go and like do my own thing over here. And then like when you have a competitive advantage, then you go to that block. So like the gameplay, the suggested gameplay is quite good. The gameplay in actuality like negates what they're trying to do, I think. So maybe having something which was about that discussion about that, why do we put things here? How do we do this? Like, then you get people questioning and thinking about the past rather than just like, ha, I got 5 points more than you. I'm the queen of Hoyuk.
I love that idea that you can make people, you can create social rules that force people to behave in particular ways, and they may be ways they're not used to behaving. That's really cool idea.
This is another thing as well. Like in game design, we've been like really fixated, especially recently, like with AAA games, about like this thing of like Ludus, like having like games as rules rather than games as being like these game experiences, like Paideia, like, oh, it's like nice and like you're kind of like having a good time and like it's social and you're constructing things as you go. And like Minecraft is a good experience of it being like a constructive experience, but it often falls apart. But you know, like there's a lot of other options that we can have, I think, rather than just falling back onto expansionism and conquest.
Well, I don't know if this is just a stupid question with an obvious answer or an answerable question, but why do you think there are quite a lot of games that are based on expansion and conquest? There's like Carcassonne, there's Settlers of Catan, there's all the time different kind of knockoff versions of them. Why do you think it is that game designers are so focused on that aspect of the past whenever they incorporate the past into a game?
I'm going to summarize a really complex and big discipline of study into like 2 points. First one is that like a lot of the history of games, especially board games, is war games, and they're specifically designed to let people practice tactics. So it's a natural progression, like things like chess, right? We kind of play them and like, ah, that's so fun. But like the literal game is about conquest and troop movements and learning how things work. So that kind of just translates into those things we're comfortable with. We know how to do them. That I'm going to say easy, like they're not easy to design, but they're easy to kind of, because we have such a good history of them, to see how to construct it. And then I guess as well, like with the kind of move that's been quite recently, making games is expensive, and getting people to sign off on them requires them to know that it'll sell well. And of course, having a long history of stuff where it's like, oh, so this is a tile placement competitive game. It's like, cool, like we can point to all those games that you mentioned. And they're like, great, those sold really well. So this probably will as well. Doing something different is really hard. Like you have to not only make a really good case, but be willing to front it yourself. And a lot of people are just like, you know, it's a very discrete subset of people who are like, I really like Hoyuk and I really like board game design. Like getting these things together is, yeah. I hope that answered that.
So I mean, mechanics are a dog's breakfast.
Yes.
Let's put that aside. But I mean, clearly there's this other sort of problematic categories, the archaeological sort of representations. And this is a commercially produced board game, even though it's a Kickstarter. But there are other sort of commercially, Euro board games that are cultural, archaeological, historical, a huge swath of them. So in those cases, in games that are primarily commercial games, they're not serious games, they're not educational games. Is it the responsibility of the publisher to if they're leveraging sort of this sort of archaeological knowledge, whether it's pseudo or otherwise, do you think it's their responsibility to do it better, to get it closer to verisimilitude, or at least sort of an idea of that? How do you, because they're not making a Neolithic simulator.
No, exactly.
So where is it their responsibility if they're using those tropes?
I think I'm going to throw to Megan in a bit for this one, because I think there is some stuff to talk about here ethically as well. But on a blanket level, I think a lot of the problem, I can't speak to board games, but when I did my master's research, a lot of the design companies that I was in, a lot of the studios, were really interested, but they just had no idea how. They were just like, I would love to make a good Neolithic game, and I would love to speak to you about what the mechanics are, but they're like, we don't have access, we don't have enough money to buy the journals, we don't actually know where to look. And if you speak to an archaeologist, not a games archaeologist, and you're like, so tell me about how the Neolithic worked, and you just get this and they're just like, oh, I have no idea what to do with that. So that's not really what you're asking, but I think that it's people are keen. Is there a duty of care? On the one hand, these are entertainment products, but on the other hand, they have a serious implication for how people perceive our discipline and how us as a discipline as well can actually represent ourselves. It's really hard to overthrow those if we're throwing out white papers and kind of doing our journal publication. We're like, why can't you just see how awesome this is? And then you just get capitalism, the board game, Mark 56. So I think that it's not so much that there's a duty of care in terms of the entertainment, but I think that there is the potential to work with people. It's not don't make these games, but it's having a discussion to make it possible. Ethics.
Yeah. Ethically, from an ethical standpoint, the game company only has a responsibility, technically, to, on a Kickstarter, anyone that they funded through. So while we look at it as archaeologists and say, yes, they have a responsibility to do right by us and to right by the archaeology, technically they don't.
Yeah, exactly.
And you see it in games like this where we could remove the name from this and remove some of the overt sections of text within the game and call it anything else, and it functionally would not really be an archaeological game anymore. It would just be a game that has a very interesting aesthetic. And so I'm torn ethically on what the responsibility is there, because I think that if they were more clearly going with something where we could see where they went wrong in a direct representation, then I would say they had more of an ethical responsibility to get that representation right. But since they didn't, it's since they didn't go with a clear, we are absolutely going for the truth on this, but we just got it wrong, I don't know that there's really a lot of ethical breach in how they represented it. And they didn't represent our interests as archaeologists wrong, because they didn't place us in the context of this game at all.
Yeah.
I know lots of people.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we just were doing a brief tour.
It's got a whole lot more audience.
Yeah.
Sit down and listen.
Yeah.
Right. This is one of the many kind of informal seminars and things that we get together and talk about big ideas in archaeology and heritage. And what we really like to talk about sometimes is the way pop culture can interact with heritage. And so we have Tara, who is a PhD student, Tara Copplestone, and she's done some really interesting, really advanced research to do with video games in archaeology. And we find it a really, really powerful medium in which to engage both young people really of all ages, with archaeology and with understandings of heritage. And so right now she's performing a critique of a board game that so we're trying to think of other ways that we can actually inject some of our archaeological knowledge. And is it useful? Is it powerful? Can we do this in better ways?
Excellent.
Thank you. And just quickly, while we've interrupted you, anyway, this is one of our teaching spaces. We have K133, you've been and you've seen the kind of traditional lecture theatre. We also have rooms like this, which is a bit more flexible to move around. It could be lecture style when you need it to be, but we can also move around the chairs and have it more informal seminar, people sitting around in a group when we need it to be. So that kind of teaching as well. So thank you so much, Colleen, for letting us come in. I would really like to have a go at the board game.
You're more than welcome.
Thank you today.
And thanks for stopping by. So I find really interesting, Tara, is that there was an available visual lexicon for Chatlavic that they're able to draw from. That's clearly somehow they got a hold of the imagery, they got a hold of the reconstructions, the interpretations, at least enough to kind of visually inform this. And so I almost wonder, could you trace a lineage? Is it Swaggers? Is it inspired by the Melart shrines? What can you identify any of the traits that might have been inspired by it?
It's a little bit all over the place. Like there's definitely some Melart stuff, but like on the board itself, there's a lot of the Göbekli Tepe stuff as well.
Yeah.
So they've kind of like made this really interesting like collage of like Anatolian Neolithicness. But I think like they actually consulted with some people as well, but they were not, as far as I could tell, like they weren't associated with the university. Not that that's a bad thing, but it's like that their thing was shamanism. And so the game's consultancy revolved around this idea of shamanism and like not necessarily the archaeology, which again, to refer to Ethan's point, like isn't necessarily problematic. But I think it's something as archaeologists we need to be quite aware of as well. It's like when we're putting out our work, if we want good representation, if we want good mechanics, we need to also speak to that. Like we can't just expect designers to be like, I know exactly how to make mechanics out of Neolithicness. Like I think that's something that's our duty of care as well. And I guess the same with the imagery. It's like not that you want to restrict and kind of like tell people what they should look at, but it's being a bit sensitive about like how do we discuss that stuff.
It's interesting because in early days of the internet, we were always like, oh my God, what if we put a picture of archaeology online and somebody uses it? That was really a big conversation for a long time. And so I think it is, I know, and it's quite interesting. It's like, is this an impact case study? Is it what we have to always deal with? Can you actually see, okay, somebody then took something that we leaked out online probably and actually turned it into a game? I think it's kind of fantastic, but you're right. I think there is a duty of care. And so how much we would have been able to impart more information through these images, that we would have been able to build like some kind of interpretive constellation around these that would improve their interpretation of them.
Well, I think as well, like part of this is that we don't have a language at the moment for like game mechanics and archaeology. Like we're kind of hodgepodging together like stuff from all around the place. And it's only quite recently that we've had people who are really speaking to, I mean, I could say quite recently in the terms of archaeology, like, Ethan really kicked it off back in 2002, I believe. And then from there, it's kind of been steamrolling away. But it's like, we still don't really have what is like, we say like Neolithic mechanic, but it's like, okay, like I'm just drawing like an archaeology word and a games word and like mashing them together. Like until we have a way to actually speak to games designers and speak amongst ourselves about this stuff, I think it's still like, you can put as much as you want up there, but it's gonna be like a bit dubious as to how everyone accesses it.
Because everybody just uses it like a Pinterest board or something.
Yeah, and you take the coolest stuff, right? You're like, oh, like a bull's head stuck on a rock. Like that's cool looking. I'm gonna stick that in there.
I'm guessing there was no overt collaboration or even outreach from the game developer to the English channel to.
Well, this is the thing.
Through the stuff, they just picked and chose and did it.
We're an intimidating group, like, and I say this like based on my research and not because we actually are, but it's like game designers have operated in their bubble. We operate in our bubble, and it's like they often do want to reach out, and they are genuinely very interested. But it's like if we don't have the language to speak to them, and if we just like talk at them, they're just going to be like, well, I'm going to do what I'm going to do anyway. Like, that was a waste of my time. So it's trying to find that middle ground, I guess, where we can speak to them and we can be like, we are approachable, but then also at the same time not overriding it. Sorry, yeah.
No, just to follow on that then, are there any kind of intellectual property issues between game design and working with another country's patrimony or something like that?
Yeah.
Is there anything going on?
Go ahead, Megan. This is your.
Yes, there are. If the site is either nationally designated, if the site has any sort of international designation, if the site has any copyright placed on it anywhere, then yes, you can technically be infringing upon both cultural patrimony and intellectual property. We have not seen any cases yet where there's been any action taken, but there are rumblings. Certain countries do not like to see their heritage represented in pop culture in ways that they don't have a hand in.
I have a question for you. So, like, you can copyright images, you can copyright sound. Can you copyright mechanics? Like, if I was to have the mechanic of Hoyukness, is that something?
That is currently something that people are pushing through.
Interesting.
Because, some companies have said, yes, this particular technique is ours.
Yeah.
You can't use this, or this mechanic is ours, but it generally only gets litigated as the individual expression.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. I think that's something as well to bear in mind, because like if we were to create like a dictionary of mechanics that work for archaeology, or like discussion pieces for it, I'm bearing the ethical stuff and the legal stuff in mind as well as part of that interaction. Slight divergence, but great.
Should we all go and look at the game real fast before?
Yes.
We don't have to clean it all up.
Before
before
we
the next
end the live
2
stream, Leiden wanted to let you know that they've been watching.
Ah, hi Leiden! Hi Value!
So, there you go.
Awesome.
Thank
All
you
right.
so much.
No,
Brilliant.
and if anyone wants to play, like, I'm more than happy to.
Turn off our audio before we start talking.
Go for it.